welcome. We're the place that takes those huge stacks of research, all the complex ideas flying around, and boils them down to what you really need to know about the big shifts happening in our world.
And today, we're tackling a massive question, maybe the question of our time: what comes after globalization? We're going deep into Michael O'Sullivan's 2019 book, The Leveling. What's next after globalization?
Yeah, that title alone, it really signals a huge change in perspective is needed.
It does. And O'Sullivan's core argument is that we're living through a kind of historical earthquake, a fundamental shift.
So our goal here is to cut through the noise, right? The daily headlines, the political chaos, and really focus on these underlying, tectonic changes O'Sullivan talks about, trying to find the operating manual for whatever comes next.
Exactly. He sees things like Brexit, Trump's election, new governments popping up in Italy or Mexico.
Yeah.
He doesn't see those as the root causes. They're more like the detonators.
The wrecking balls, he calls them.
Yeah, the wrecking balls hitting that old system, the one built up after the Cold War ended, after communism fell apart.
Okay, but lots of times feel like big changes, like rupture. Why does he insist this time is fundamentally different, a real tectonic shift?
He does acknowledge history repeats itself, the rise and fall of nations, that kind of thing. We've seen power shift before.
Sure.
But he argues this era has unique factors, things truly unprecedented. Think about information, how it moves now.
Social media.
Right. It's everywhere. Polarization, political fights, they just get amplified globally, instantly. The people who built the last global order, they didn't have to deal with anything like that.
And then you add the economic layer on top. It gets even clearer. Post-2008, 2009, the central banks.
Oh, absolutely. Their influence is just unparalleled, possibly irreversible. Trillions pumped into the system through quantitative easing.
It feels like we're hooked on it now.
It creates this huge dependence. And this monetary dominance feeds into a really critical geopolitical shift, O'Sullivan points out. The U.S.,
which used to be the anchor, right? The stability provider through the IMF, the Treasury.
Exactly. The locus and architect of stability, he calls it. But now, it's often become the provocateur of volatility.
Wow. So when the main stabilizer starts shaking things up?
The whole system starts to fracture. It has to.
Okay, so we've got these completely new economic tools, technology tearing things apart. But he doesn't just throw history out. He looks back, finds inspiration for solutions in the past.
He does. He looks at another moment of huge change. The mid-17th century.
Interesting. Why then?
It was a really pivotal time. You had the end of the 30 Years' War, which led to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
That's the treaty that basically established the idea of modern nation states, right? Sovereign borders, mutual recognition.
Precisely. It set the political map we still use today. But at the same time, over in England, you had the English Civil War brewing, and that conflict sparked some of the first real grassroots discussions about modern democracy.
And that leads us to the book's namesake, right? The Levelers.
The Levelers. Yeah, they're a fascinating piece of history. O'Sullivan actually found his inspiration near St. Mary's Church in Putney. That's where the famous Putney debates happened in 1647.
And for anyone listening who doesn't know them, these weren't debates in Parliament.
No, not at all. These were intense, revolutionary talks between the high-ranking officers and the ordinary soldiers, the rank and file, in Cromwell's New Model Army. It's really seen as the birthplace, the crucible of modern constitutional democracy.
I love that idea,
Yeah.
that the future of how we govern ourselves was being hammered out by regular people, soldiers, tradespeople.
Exactly. Ordinary folks, many radicalized by the war and just deeply fed up with a parliament they felt had lost touch. They were angry that the law seemed different for the rich, the grandees versus the poor. But their demands weren't just about tearing things down. They were constructive. They actually wrote down arguments for equality, for democracy, in these proposals called the Agreements of the People. And O'Sullivan uses that historical example, this idea of ordinary people demanding a written, fixable contract based on trust, as a kind of model for how we could repair our own politics, economics, and finance today.
So the leveling isn't just chaos. It's actually pointing towards a way to rebuild based on the 17th century democratic push. Okay, let's get into the breakdown itself then. O'Sullivan talks about the tide goes out. What tide is he talking?
The tide is globalization itself, plain and simple. He argues that whole process, the integration of economies, markets, nations, cultures, which really peaked between the 90s and maybe 2007.
Before the financial crisis.
Right before the crisis. That process is now in retreat. And crucially, he thinks the peak is behind us. It's not likely coming back in the same way.
And he's got evidence for this, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a feeling. We can see it in the data.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Things like cross-border flows of financial assets or foreign direct investment, FDI, the money companies spend building things or buying assets overseas, way down from the pre-crisis peaks. And on top of that, you've got governments actively putting up barriers. Restrictions are throttling the flows. Look at the US and China, capital controls, investment screening. They're deliberately trying to limit money moving across borders.
So when that global pie stops getting bigger for everyone, the mood changes.
Completely. It shifts from let's grow together to how do I get my slice? That's the fixed pie idea O'Sullivan talks about.
The beggar thy neighbor mentality.
Exactly. If the pie isn't growing, then one country's gain starts to look like another country's loss. And the US-China trade dispute, that's just the most obvious example of this playing out. It's visceral.
And the data on protectionism itself, it's pretty stark, isn't it? Who's putting up the most walls?
Maybe surprisingly, given its history, it's the United States. O'Sullivan points out that the U.S. now implements the most trade protectionist measures globally. By a lot. He says it's nearly 9-1. Protectionist measures outnumber liberalizing ones almost 9 times over in the U.S. Russia and India are also high up there. This isn't a minor adjustment. It's a fundamental U-turn from the free trade consensus of the last few decades.
Okay, so the economic tide goes out, walls go up, and this exposes cracks that were maybe hidden before. Social fault lines.
Deep ones. And one of the most powerful concepts he uses here is the poverty of expectations.
How does that work?
It really captures the difference between the developed world and the emerging world right now. In mature economies, the US, Europe, Japan generations are facing flat or even falling expectations.
About basic things,
Yeah.
like income, life expectancy.
Yeah, income, life expectancy, social mobility, the idea that you'll do better than your parents. If that promise fades, if people expect less for themselves and their kids, it creates this deep, generationally rooted disappointment, and that fuels political anger.
But in the emerging world, it's different, almost the opposite problem.
Almost. He calls it the dilemma of expectations. Think about places like Mexico or Brazil. They've seen rapid growth, right? So aspirations have shot up. People want higher incomes, better education, Western lifestyles.
Okay.
But if that progress suddenly stalls, maybe because of corruption or an economic downturn, and those rising aspirations get checked, bam, the potential for volatility is huge. It's this tension between what people desperately want and what they can actually get.
And alongside this economic disappointment, there's a cultural or social loss. He talks about using the German word Heimat.
Heimat. Yeah, it's a great word. It means more than just homeland. It's about that sense of a familiar, trustworthy place, shared values, local culture.
A sense of belonging.
Exactly. And O'Sullivan argues that the forces of globalization, maybe technology, mass migration, they can dislocate people from this feeling of Heimat. They feel disconnected from the values, the predictable ways of life that shaped their communities.
And that loss makes people react defensively.
Instinctively. They might push back against things they see as disruptive forces, whether it's new tech-changing jobs, rapid social shifts, or immigration. It's a fear of losing the familiar.
He uses Manchester United as an example of this, doesn't he? How a local institution changes.
It's a brilliant illustration. Man United used to be deeply rooted in its local community, defined by its character, its local players. It was part of the city's identity.
An anchor.
Right. But then, through globalization, it became this massive global consumer brand, billions flowing in from overseas.
Success in one way.
In one way, yes. But O'Sullivan argues that by chasing the global market, by maybe sacrificing some of those local roots, that distinct character, that very British never say die spirit, it lost something vital, maybe its soul. And he suggests maybe even its winning ways on the pitch suffered. It's a small story reflecting a bigger trend.
Local identity versus the global market. And underlying all of this, the disappointment, the loss of Heimat, the political instability is the big one. Inequality.
He points to this as the absolute core driver of the political volatility we're seeing. And it's important, he says, to distinguish between income inequality, which we talk about a lot,
And wealth inequality.
and wealth inequality, which he argues is actually more serious, more destabilizing. The numbers he quotes are just jaw-dropping. The top 1% of wealthy people, they now own over 47% of the world's total wealth.
Wait, to say it again, over 47%?
Just under half of everything, owned by the top 1%. He says those are levels of concentration we haven't seen, certainly in the U.S., since maybe the 1930s.
That's incredible. That's not just an economic data point. That feels like political dynamite. How did it get so extreme?
You can see why large parts of the population feel the system is rigged against them. There was research, I think, by McKinsey showing that between 2005 and 2014, something like 75%, three-quarters of the working population in 25 advanced economies saw their real incomes either stagnate or actually fall.
So people are working maybe harder, but not getting ahead.
Exactly. Productivity might go up, but their income stays flat. Trust
Oh.
just evaporates in that scenario.
In the response to the 2008 crisis, all the low interest rates, the quantitative easing QE that actually made this wealth gap worse.
Absolutely. It was maybe an unintended consequence, but a devastating one. QE and near zero interest rates were meant to save the system, stabilize markets. But what they did was massively inflate the value of assets,
Stocks, bonds, property.
especially property. So if you already owned assets, you did great. The rising tide lifted your boat. But if you were middle income, trying to save up, rising property prices just cut you off, push people out of city centers.
He mentions that story about Kate Downing, the planning commissioner in Palo Alto.
Yeah, it's such a sharp example. Here's a dedicated public servant in a key role in Silicon Valley, but she had to publicly resign because even on her good salary, she couldn't afford to live in the community she was serving.
Her mortgage would have eaten her whole salary.
Her entire pre-tax salary, just for the mortgage on a modest place, it just shows how policies like QE ended up being this massive accidental wealth transfer mechanism, making basics like housing unaffordable, even for essential professionals.
Which leads us right into the next big theme. This idea of the central bank comfort blanket. Are we basically in an economic dead end, just propped up by extreme measures?
That's the uncomfortable picture of Sullivan Payne's global growth is sputtering out, losing its organic drive, and it's being sustained almost entirely by incredibly high levels of debt globally and these really aggressive actions by central bank.
Are they worse than before the last crisis?
Significantly higher, actually. Global debt to GDP ratios are higher today than they were back in 2008, just before the financial system melted down.
That doesn't sound good. And is this new debt funding productive things? Innovation, infrastructure.
Mostly no. That's the critical problem. Most of this new debt is non-productive. It's not building the future. It's being used to, as he puts it, patch up economic holes or fuel things like stock buybacks, financial engineering, or just basically buy time.
Kicking the can down the road.
Pretty much, it's economic postponement, not progress.
And this dependence creates what he calls the central bank Leviathan. He describes QE as like financial morphine.
It's a powerful analogy, isn't it? Morphine helps with the pain, takes the edge off a crisis, provides stability, but it doesn't cure the underlying disease. And worse, you can get addicted.
And it seems like we are addicted.
It's become the norm, the default financial policy, even in economies that you'd think wouldn't need such drastic medicine. O'Sullivan points to Sweden's Riksbank doing QE even when their GDP growth was strong, like 5%, and inflation was picking up.
Giving painkillers when the patient isn't even critically ill.
Exactly. It shows how normalized, how ingrained this reliance on monetary stimulus has become worldwide.
So the central banks gained all this power. They essentially made a deal, didn't they? We'll buy you financial stability. What was the price politicians paid?
The price was twofold. First, it led to this dulling of market sensitivities to risk. If everyone knows the central bank will step in,
The Fed put.
the Fed put, the ECB put,
Yeah.
then markets stop pricing risk properly. You get asset bubbles, bad investments because the consequences are muffled. But the second, maybe bigger cost. It removed the urgency for politicians to actually tackle the underlying structural problems.
Why make tough choices if the central bank can just paper over the cracks?
Precisely. Central banks became more powerful than governments in many ways, but their interventions let politicians off the hook for fixing things like debt, inequality, stagnant wages.
And this power is often wrapped in deliberate complexity.
Yeah.
Greenspan's famous line.
Oh, yeah. If I have made myself clear, you must have misunderstood me. It's part of the mystique, this tradition of, well, obfuscation, keeping the public, maybe even politicians, slightly in the dark.
And that's a long way from the original idea of how central banks should act in a crisis, isn't it? Bagehot's Dictum.
A very long way. Walter Bagehot, writing back in 1873 about the Bank of England, laid out the classic rules for a lender of last resort during a panic.
What were they? Lend freely.
Lend freely, yes, but crucially against good collateral and at a high rate of interest to penalty rate. The key things were, don't take dodgy assets onto your books, and make sure the rescue doesn't create moral hazard, doesn't reward bad behavior.
And modern QE breaks both those rules.
You could definitely argue that. By buying up huge amounts of government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, sometimes even corporate debt, central banks have taken on assets of varying quality. And by keeping interest rates near zero for a decade, they massively distorted financial incentives, arguably rewarding excessive debt. It's a totally different philosophy from Bagehot.
Okay, so if this central bank comfort blanket is preventing markets from working properly and politicians from acting, how do we get rid of it? O'Sullivan proposes something really ambitious, a Westphalia Treaty for Finance.
Yeah, this is where he brings that historical parallel right into the present. Just like the original Peace of Westphalia in 1648 forced states to take responsibility for their own borders and actions.
Creating political sovereignty.
This new treaty, born out of a global conference, would focus on debt and risk. It would aim to force nations to take greater responsibility for their own financial health.
So the goal isn't just managing debt, it's changing behavior, encouraging risk-bearing, not risk-sharing.
That's the core idea. Stop spreading the risk everywhere through bailouts and endless QE. Make countries, banks, investors actually bear the consequences of their decisions.
And how would this treaty work in practice? What's the mechanism?
The idea is that the world's major central banks, or really their political bosses, would formally agree to use these extraordinary tools, like QE, only under truly exceptional predefined conditions. Really severe, measurable market stress.
So QE comes off the table as the go-to solution for every wobble.
Exactly. It becomes the absolute last resort, not the first.
That would be a massive policy shift. If politicians knew they couldn't just rely on the central bank printing money every time things got choppy.
They'd have to be more proactive, wouldn't they? More fiscally responsible. They'd have to actually plan for crises, address the underlying debt problems, the structural issues.
And markets would have to price risk properly again because the safety net wouldn't be guaranteed.
That's the theory. It forces discipline back into the system both for markets and for governments. It basically puts accountability back where it belongs with elected officials.
It's quite a jump, though, from talking about central bank treaties back to those 17th century radicals, the levelers. How does O'Sullivan connect their fight against broken trust to today's political mess?
The link is actually pretty direct. Think about what angered the original levelers. They saw an elite, the grandees, that was out of touch, applied laws unfairly, treated the rich differently from the poor. They felt a lack of fairness.
And people feel that today.
Absolutely. The same sense of disconnect, of unfairness. So O'Sullivan says the levelers' focus wasn't just anger. It was about finding a tangible, constructive solution. And that's the spirit he thinks we need now.
So the political fix starts with repairing that broken contract, like their agreements of the people.
That's the model. He even proposes a kind of modern version, a framework called the Agreement of the People 21st Century.
What would that involve?
It's about setting out principles for a new social contract, a world where people aren't dominated by big tech or finance, where leaders are genuinely held accountable for the risks they create, financial or otherwise, and really importantly, where human development, things like health, education, well-being, becomes a central goal of growth, not just GDP numbers.
A blueprint for fairness and accountability.
Pretty much. And the need for this new thinking is obvious when you look at how fractured traditional politics has become.
Yeah, the numbers on distrust are shocking. Volatility, apathy.
They're at post-World War II highs in many places. He mentioned something like 80% of Europeans distrusting traditional political parties. That kind of vacuum, that collapse of faith, is exactly why radical parties have surged.
Especially on the populist right, often linked to economic shocks.
Yes, there's often a strong link. Financial crises, deindustrialization, these events create openings for parties offering simple answers, often nationalist ones, because the established centrist parties seem unable or unwilling to address the root causes. They fill the void.
So if the old parties are failing, what might replace them? Sullivan actually sketches out some fictional party models, doesn't he?
He does, as a way to think about where politics could go. First, there's the levelers, obviously inspired by the originals. Their focus would be on reform, equality, transparency, holding politicians accountable. Very constructive.
Okay, a reformist party. What else?
Then you have the diggers. They're imagined as more left-wing, very focused on the environment. Think heavy carbon taxes, big spending on mental health, cross-border green initiatives, prioritizing sustainable human development over pure economic growth.
So an environmentalist, socially focused party. The third one sounds a bit darker, though. The Leviathan party.
Right. The Leviathan party is based on that classic Hobbesian trade-off. It essentially offers citizens a deal, give up some personal freedom, maybe some democracy, in exchange for strong central control, absolute order, and personal safety.
Security over liberty.
Exactly. O'Sullivan suggests its appeal might be strongest in places that feel unstable, maybe middle-sized Asian countries or volatile emerging economies where people prioritize order above all else. He frames the future political battle as being between this leveler model freedom and accountability and the Leviathan model order and security.
But who leads any of these movements? Or even runs the existing systems effectively? He says politics has a labor market problem. What does he mean?
He means it's really hard to get talented, experienced people from outside politics to actually enter public service. Successful people from business, science, nonprofits. They often look at politics and see intense hostility, media intrusion, partisan gridlock.
I think, why would I put myself through that?
Exactly. Why bother if I can't get anything done anyway? So, to fix this, O'Sullivan calls for new blood. He champions the idea of the biopolitician.
A biopolitician. What defines them? Not a career politician.
Definitely not. The biopolitician is someone who comes into politics from the outside with a track record of real-world achievement and strong principles, intending to serve for a limited time to tackle specific problems, not build a lifelong career.
He contrasts someone like Boris Johnson with Lord Carrington.
Yes, it's a stark contrast. Carrington famously resigned as UK Foreign Secretary on principle after the Falklands invasion in '82, taking responsibility. Johnson is presented more as the opportunistic careerist. The biopolitician ideal is closer to Carrington, someone of substance entering service, not just seeking power.
And his idea for identifying them is interesting. Labeling politicians like food.
Yeah, it's provocative. But it's a serious suggestion to tackle that labor market problem and rebuild trust. The idea is to somehow clearly distinguish between the career apparatchiks who've only ever known the party machine and these outsiders entering from other walks of life.
To signal to voters.
Yeah.
This person isn't just in it for themselves.
Right. It's about signaling competence, principle, and a focus on solving problems, not just playing political games. A way to maybe attract better candidates and restore some public faith.
Okay, let's shift from domestic politics to the global stage. This is where the ultimate leveling happens, right? The distribution of power between nations. What does this emerging multipolar world look like, according to O'Sullivan?
He's very clear. America's global dominance is fading. Globalization as we knew it is giving way to a world shaped not by one superpower, but by maybe 3 or 4 major regional poles.
And he has specific criteria for what counts as a pole.
Very specific. It's not just about having a big army. It's a combination. Large GDP, big population, a history of regional influence or empire, a strong regional economic role, military size, and high scores on human development relative to others in their region.
So, based on that checklist, who makes the cut? The U.S., obviously. China.
The U.S., China, and the European Union are the clear poles. But he also explains why some powerful countries don't qualify.
Like Russia or Japan.
Exactly. Russia has the military, the imperial history, but its economy is relatively small and shrinking demographically, and its human development isn't top tier. Its power isn't based on strong, durable institutions. Japan has the economy and development, but lacks the demographic weight and maybe the independent geopolitical projection.
So for countries that want to become poles or just build stable, successful societies in this new era, they need more than just factories and roads. They need intangible infrastructure. He brings in Alexander Hamilton here.
Yeah, Hamilton is a shorthand for the crucial task of nation building. Not just physical infrastructure, but the intangible stuff. Strong institutions, reliable laws, skilled people. These are the foundations for durable economic growth, high human development, a stable public life.
And this intangible infrastructure is actually more important than the physical stuff.
O'Sullivan argues it's much more crucial for long-term success. Pouring concrete is easy. Building trust through rule of law is hard, but essential.
What are the key pillars of this intangible structure?
He lists 5 main ones: education, healthcare finance, stable and well-regulated, business services like law, accounting, and technology, access and skills.
And how do these build national strength? Is it about governance?
It all ties back to governance quality. Good institutions, especially the rule of law, create trust. And trust encourages investment, not just foreign money, but citizens investing in their own skills, their own futures, their own communities. He shows a strong statistical link, for example, between a country's rule of law score and its GDP per capita. Bad governance destroys trust, no matter how many bridges you build.
Okay, so if the world is becoming multipolar, based on these strong regional players with good institutions, what happens to the old global institutions? The UN, IMF, World Bank.
They inevitably become less central, less powerful. That's a consequence of the leveling. These institutions were mostly designed for a US-led unipolar or bipolar world. In a truly multipolar world, the big poles often just bypass them or ignore them when it suits their national interests. We see the US doing this, China building alternatives.
They become defunct or less relevant.
Increasingly. But this decay also creates space for new kinds of alliances, new governance models to emerge.
Like the small advanced countries getting together.
Yes, this is one of his really interesting ideas. He looks at countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Ireland, Singapore, New Zealand.
Highly developed, stable democracies, but relatively small on the global stage.
Exactly. They face similar challenges: how to navigate a world dominated by these large, sometimes volatile poles. O'Sullivan suggests they have a real incentive to form coalitions, maybe an informal alliance. He calls it Hanseatic League 2.0.
After the medieval trading league.
Right. The original Hanseatic League was a coalition of Northern European trading cities that banded together for mutual economic benefit and protection. This new version wouldn't be military, but a bloc focused on shared values and coordinated policy.
And because they tend to score so highly on governance, transparency, human development.
He argues they could collectively become a kind of moral authority in world affairs, a stable, principled counterweight to the power politics of the big poles.
We're also seeing power shift downwards, not just sideways, to the city level.
Yes, partly out of necessity, especially on issues like climate change. Cities are where most people live, and where a huge chunk of pollution originates. He quotes figures like 71, 76%.
So mayors might be able to act where national governments are stuck.
Often, yes. City governments can be more pragmatic, less gridlocked. So for certain global challenges, particularly environmental ones, we might see governance and solutions increasingly happening at the city level, bypassing national inertia.
Okay, one last big area, technology, specifically big tech. O'Sullivan compares their dominance now to the banks before the 2008 crisis. How do we handle their power and the related issue of cyber risk in this new world?
It's a huge challenge. He floats the idea of a tech version of the Glass-Steagall Act, the old law that separated commercial and investment banking. So maybe breaking up giants like Amazon or Google, separating their cloud services from their retail or search businesses.
Makes sense in theory, maybe, but is it likely?
He's skeptical, and the reason is geopolitics. These companies, whether U.S. ones like Google or Chinese ones like Alibaba, are increasingly seen by their home countries as vital strategic national assets.
Tools of geopolitical power.
Exactly. So voluntarily breaking them up seems unlikely when they offer national leverage.
So if breaking them up isn't feasible, the focus has to be on international governance, especially for cyber threats.
That becomes critical. We urgently need rules of the road for cyber warfare. O'Sullivan calls for a digital Geneva Convention, something that defines what counts as a state-sponsored cyber attack, establishes standards for proof who did it, and outlines acceptable international responses.
And that negotiation probably has to involve the U.S. and Russia primarily.
Given their capabilities and history in this domain, he suggests any meaningful convention would likely have to be built around the U.S.-Russia axis, however difficult that relationship is.
Wow. Okay, so this whole framework, the leveling, it covers so much ground. Wealth concentration, central banks, geopolitics, technology. It feels overwhelming, but necessary to grasp.
It really is a description of a total paradigm shift. O'Sullivan argues we're still in the early stages, where that old consensual order built after World War II is visibly crumbling, driven by debt, political anger, and this fundamental leveling of economic power across the globe.
And the only way forward is to stop reacting to the daily noise and focus on these bigger structural issues with new ideas.
Exactly. New constructive ideas that cut across all these areas: politics, economics, finance, diplomacy. We need a new framework.
So to sum up the leveling concept,
Yeah.
it's about political accountability being leveled.
Power being leveled away from unaccountable central banks.
Wealth hopefully being leveled, or at least the gap narrowed, between rich and poor countries.
And finally, power itself being leveled between nations, leading to this multipolar reality.
And surviving that whole transition, O'Sullivan argues, depends on strengthening that internal, intangible infrastructure.
Those hidden pillars.
Ciao.
Education, health, rule of law. They're what make a country resilient through these kinds of massive shifts.
Which brings us perfectly to our final thought for you, the listener. If O'Sullivan is right, if the core challenge, especially for developed nations, is this failure to invest in intangible infrastructure, the foundations of national strength, Then what single area of human capability do you think is the most urgent investment a country needs to make right now to navigate this transition? Is it education? Is it health? Or is it strengthening the rule of law?
Something to think about. Building roads is visible, easy to sell. Building institutional trust, investing in people's health and skills. That's harder, less flashy, but as O'Sullivan argues, it might be far more critical for thriving, or even just surviving, in the century ahead.